She should have left after the Sakontalas dance, the gap between sets was her window. Eleanor Gray had calculated it precisely. The moment the musicians set down their bows to retune, she would drift toward Lady Pemberton on the left close enough to suggest she was mid-conversation. Too far from the door to appear to be fleeing, and from there she could make her exit in 4 minutes without attracting the kind of attention that would fuel next week's gossip columns. She had learned to calculate these things. 6 years of careful arithmetic. 5 years of actually needing it.th. Musicians finished their retuning. Eleanor made her drift toward Lady Pemberton's left shoulder, smiled at something the woman said that she hadn't heard, and turned toward the corridor. Lady Blackwood, the voice came from directly behind her. Close enough that she felt the warmth of it before she processed the sound. She recognized it before she turned. Her body knew at first some animal thing in her chest that had no business still being op ratio. NAL after 5 years, and by the time her mind had caught up, she had already slowed her turning by half a beat. James Ashton, Duke of Nottingham, stood 3 feet away. 5 years had done nothing to him. The same dark hair, the same line of jaw. The same grey eyes that had never belonged to a soft color. They were the color of cathedral steps in November. The color of London sky in the hour before rain decides to commit. He wore black and white with the kind of simplicity that cost a great deal of money to achieve. And he held himself the way he always had, like a man who had never once been uncertain about where he was standing, that he inclined his head. "Might I have this dance?" His voice was perfectly calibrated. Polite. Distant. The exact register one used with an acquaintance of some standing and no particular significance. The last waltz of the season was beginning. She could hear the musicians pulling their bows across the first long note. Eleanor could say no. A.W. Idow of 14 months could decline any invitation without explanation. Half the matrons in this room would happily provide one on her behalf. She had earned the right to refusal. She had paid for it in installments over the better part of a year, but he had crossed the room toward her in full view of 200 people, positioning himself at her back precisely as she turned to leave. If she refused, the papers would have it by Tuesday. The Duchess who wasn't declines the Nottingham waltz. Every speculation about why she had married Blackwood in the first place would resurface. Every theory about why the engagement had ended would be revisited with fresh appetite that he had known this. Of course he had. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, the grip light enough to feel like almost nothing, like a man who didn't trust himself to hold tighter. His palm was dry and warm, exactly as she remembered from the last time he had touched her hand, which had also been the last time. Which she had told herself she did not remember. He led her onto the floor. He danced well. He had always danced well. His steps were clean, his lead precise, not a single movement wasted. His right hand sat at the correct position on her back, correct to the inch, correct to the ounce of pressure. The way a man dances when he is performing dancing rather than doing it. She fixed her gaze on a point slightly above his cravat. He looked over her head at something on the far side of the room. For 30 seconds they were simply two people moving in a prescribed pattern. It was almost manageable. You cut your hair," he said. She said nothing. "Last autumn, I think." His tone had not changed. Still the pleasant neutral of a man remarking on the weather. "It suits you." She had cut it in October, 3 weeks after the funeral. Because she had not been able to manage it alone, the length of it. The weight of it in her hands every morning. Because the particular motion of winding it up with pins had belonged to a version of herself she was no longer willing to maintain. Because she had sat in front of her mirror one morning and thought, "This is mine to decide now." And had picked up the shears before the thought could talk itself out. He could not have known any of that. He had simply noticed she had cut it. Which meant he had looked at her at some point this season, truly looked. Not the careful studied non-looking she had observed from him across 3 ballrooms since her return, and registered the change. She did not acknowledge this. The waltz moved into its second phrase. They turned. She watched the candlelight will past his shoulder. "You've smiled 17 times this evening," he said. She maintained her expression. "I wasn't aware you were counting." "That I wasn't. Particularly." A pause. The music filled it. But none of them were real. Her hand tightened in his. Slightly. She hoped slightly. That's a rather extraordinary thing to say to someone during a dance. Yes. He didn't elaborate. The musicians were building toward the final phrase now. She could hear it in the cellos, the slight gathering of momentum that preceded the resolution. 40 more seconds. She had been counting. 30. She kept her eyes fixed on his cravat. White linen. Simply nodded. A single small crease near the right edge that his valet had missed. She concentrated on that crease with an intensity she usually reserved for quarterly accounts. 20. 30 seconds. He said, she couldn't tell whether he meant the dance or something else. The violins took the final run upward. She felt the familiar loosening in her chest that came at the end of every waltz. The slight bracing for the moment when she could step back and resume the careful management of the distance between herself and every other person in this room. His hand did not release her. The music stopped. Around them. A scatter of applause for the musicians from the older guests at the edges of the room. Couples separated, reformed, drifted toward the supper tables. In the middle of the floor, Eleanor stood with her hand still in James Ashton's and his right hand still at her back. His thumb resting with a pressure so light it could have been accidental against her lowest rib. She looked up. He was looking at her. Not at the room. Not at the wall behind her head. At her with an expression she did not have immediate access to a name for. Something that had been kept in a closed room for a long time and had only just been allowed to stand up and didn't quite know how to walk yet. Ellie, he said, not Lady Blackwood. Not Miss Grey. Which had been her name before she became anything else. The name she had been before all of it. Engagement, the ending of the engagement. The marriage to a man 30 years her senior who had been kind in the uncomplicated way of someone who wanted very little and offered the same. The name she had been when she had still believed that wanting things was a reasonable way to live. The music was over. He was not letting go. 5 years earlier, she had been standing in the entrance hall of Ashton House when he told her. 10 in the morning, a Tuesday in March. The kind of grey day that London produces in quantity and imagination produces in retrospect when it needs a backdrop for things that should have had better weather. He had been very calm. That was what she remembered most precisely. He had been standing on the second step of the staircase. She had noticed this detail at the time without understanding it, that he had chosen to be one step above her, and he had looked at her with an expression she recognized now, years later, as controlled rather than cold. And he had said that he did not think their engagement should continue. She had asked him why. That he had said that he had given the matter considerable thought and that he did not believe they were well suited. And that it would be better for both of them to acknowledge this now rather than later. She had not cried. This was something she had continued to find remarkable about herself in the weeks that followed. That she had stood in that entrance hall while the housemaid presumably hovered behind doors somewhere and the grey March light came through the fanlight. And she had simply listened and not cried and eventually said I see and left. She had been in the carriage back to her parents' house before she noticed that her hands were shaking. Back in the present, the candlelight, his grey eyes, and his hand still not releasing hers, she said, quietly. You can let go now. That I know, he said. That he let go. Eventually, she told herself, for 3 days, that it meant nothing. The card arrived on the 4th day. That it was delivered to the offices of Meridian Press, her offices. The 3-room set on Cheyne Walk that she had been operating for 4 years under the name of a fictional male partner whose correspondence she wrote herself by a footman in Nottingham livery who waited in the doorway long enough to confirm that she had taken receipt of it personally. The card was heavy stock, his initials embossed in the corner, and contained 11 words in his handwriting. I understand you are seeking the Royal Charter. I may be of use. Below this, an address in Grosvenor Square and the hours between 2 and 5 at which he could be reached. Margaret Holt. Her editor of 4 years and the only person in London who knew what Meridian Press actually was, read the card over Eleanor's shoulder with the professional detachment of someone who had spent considerable time learning not to react visibly to things. Well, Margaret said, don't. That I wasn't going to say anything. You were composing something. That I was composing nothing. Margaret set the card down on Eleanor's desk and straightened the stack of manuscripts beside it. I was merely observing that the Committee for Press Licensing convenes in 6 weeks. And that we have, at current count, 3 letters of support from minor clergy and a member of Parliament who may not survive the next election. And that the Duke of Nottingham sits on the subcommittee that conducts the preliminary review. Eleanor looked at the card. She had built Meridian Press from the remnants of her marriage settlement, the portion that had been legally hers to keep, which had not been a large portion, and from 4 years of 17-hour days and the careful cultivation of authors that no other house in London would publish. Poetry by women writing under their own names. Natural philosophy by men without university appointments. One extraordinary and entirely unmarketable collection of essays on agricultural reform that had nonetheless sold its entire first printing of 200 copies and prompted 3 letters to the Times. The Royal Charter would make it real in the eyes of the law. It would mean she could sign contracts without the fiction of a male partner. It would mean Meridian Press could exist officially, with her name attached to it. In a way that would outlast any individual arrangement or goodwill. She had been trying to obtain it for 8 months. She was beginning to understand that the process had been designed to discourage precisely the sort of applicant she was. She turned the card over. The back was blank. That if I go Oh, him, she said, I need to know what he wants from it. Does he have to want something? Eleanor looked at her. Right, Margaret said. Reasonable question, she wrote back the same afternoon. Short, correct, the register of a professional communication. Thank you for your offer of assistance. If convenient. I would call at 3 o'clock Thursday. She did not rewrite it, she rewrote it twice. The version she sent was the third. Thursday arrived with the particular quality of late-season London light that turned everything amber and slightly unreal. Eleanor arrived at the address in Grosvenor Square at 5 minutes to 3, because arriving at 3 exactly looked like you had been watching the clock, and she had not been watching the clock, she had been watching the clock. The house was larger than she had allowed herself to picture. 4 stories of Portland stone. The kind of architectural statement that didn't need to make any noise because the stone made it for you. A butler opened the door before she reached Either they had been watching from the window or the footsteps on the steps triggered some domestic awareness she didn't possess, and she was shown Thr. Oof, a hall that managed to be both grand and lived in. With a stack of papers on the console table and one boot sitting alone beside the umbrella stand in a way that suggested its pair had been removed elsewhere, she was left in a sitting room that overlooked the square. She did not sit, she was examining a painting de landscape, Dutch. 17th century. Competent rather than remarkable. When she heard him in the hall, he appeared in the doorway and stopped when he saw her standing rather than sitting. Something crossed his expression that she catalogued and set aside. Lady Blackwood, Your Grace, thank you for coming. He indicated the chairs near the window. Please, she sat. He sat across from her, correctly distant, with the same quality of controlled ease he had brought to the dance floor. Between them, a low table with a tea service that someone had thought to provide, and neither of them reached for the Charter Committee, he said. And the conversation arranged itself into the shape of professional business with a precision she appreciated and did not entirely trust that he had done his work. He outlined the composition of the subcommittee's even members, 2 of whom were sympathetic to press expansion. 2 of whom had opposed the last 3 charter applications from independent houses. 3 who were genuinely persuadably, and described the preliminary review process with the specificity of someone who had sat through enough of them to find them tedious rather than intimidating. Your strongest argument, he said, is the agricultural reform collection. She looked at him, the one published in March of last year. He spoke without any particular emphasis. The Holbrook Essays. The second printing sold out in 10 days. Which is, given the subject matter, fairly remarkable evidence of audience development. The committee responds to evidence of demonstrated public interest. You've read them. She said. They were worth reading. The second printing was 240 copies. Yes, the title page doesn't carry the publisher's name. Something in his expression shifted very slightly, like a man who has said more than he intended and has decided not to retrieve it. No. He agreed. It doesn't. She waited to see if he would explain that he didn't. I'll have my solicitor send over the sales records, she said, after a moment. For the committee materials, that would be useful. He reached for the tea service. which she took as a signal that the meeting's formal portion was concluding. The preliminary review is the significant hurdle. If the subcommittee recommends against proceeding, the full committee rarely overrides it, and if they recommend in favor, then it becomes a question of which way the wind is blowing in the Lords that week. The corner of his mouth moved in something that didn't commit to being a smile. Which is always a question of which way the wind is blowing. She stood. He stood. She gathered her gloves from the arm of her chair. And they walked into the hall in the manner of two people who had conducted a civil and professionally satisfactory meeting and had nothing else to add. The door, the butler materialized with her coat. James took it from Hema. Small gesture. Automatic, and held it while she put it on. His hands were near her shoulders for 3 seconds. She was counting. "I'll be in touch about the subcommittee schedule." He said, "Thank you." She stepped toward the door. "Your Grace, Lady Blackwood." She was down the front steps when she heard the door close behind her. Not a sound she should have been listening for. She had not been listening for it, she had heard it anyway. The preliminary subcommittee met in a room on the second floor of the Lords that smelled of old leather and older decisions. Eleanor had been told to arrive at 10:30. She arrived at 25 past. Which was early enough to be professional and not so early as to suggest she had been anxious. She had been anxious. James was already there. Standing near the window with a folder of papers and the particular quality of stillness that she had spent 5 years trying to decide was natural to him or performed. He looked up when she entered, assessed the room with a single glance that took in her coat, her folio, and the expression she was wearing, and said, "The chairman is running late. We have perhaps 15 minutes, then we should use them." They sat at the long table not across from each other, which would have felt like negotiation, but at the corner, which felt like something else that she declined to name. He opened his folder. She opened hers. Between them, the serious business of making a case. "Roland will want evidence of public benefit," James said. He had a way of opening discussions in the middle, as though the preliminary steps were beneath the time of everyone present. Not commercial viability. He considers profit a suspect motive in publishing, then he's never tried to keep a press operational on principle alone. No. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. He has not. What does he see? On-sider public benefit, education, moral improvement, the advancement of knowledge in fields he personally finds interesting. James turned a page. Agricultural reform qualifies narrowly, and poetry, by women. He considered this with apparent seriousness. Almost certainly not. In his view, I would leave the poetry out of your materials. She had already left the poetry out of her materials. She had spent 3 evenings leaving it out, and then putting it back in, and then taking it out again because she knew it would cost her. And then feeling something cold and exact settle in her chest as she made the final version without it. The poets were real. Their work was real. But the committee would not see it that way. And she had long since made her peace with the distance between what was true and what was expedient. "Holbrook," she said. "The agricultural essays. You said that was the strongest argument that it is." He looked at her then directly. Briefly. The second essay in particular. The section on crop rotation and tenant land management. She knew that essay. She knew it the way she knew all the work she had published, not because she had read it once for acquisition purposes, but because she had read it 4 times. Argued with it in the margins, written to Holbrook twice with questions that he had answered with such gratifying seriousness that she had published his next 3 pieces without hesitation. The argument about the relationship between tenant security and long-term soil productivity. She said, "Yes." James turned another page. The committee won't frame it in those terms. They'll call it evidence of rural stability. Which is a thing they care about considerably more than soil. You've read it carefully. That I told you it was worth reading. You told me it was worth reading after you quoted the 3rd paragraph of the second essay from memory. She kept her voice level. The edition with the misprint on the title page. The one where agricultural is missing its second R. A pause. Outside the window, a cart passed on the street below. She waited that I read carefully, he said. When something is worth the attention that he said it the way he had said everything this morning with the pleasant neutrality of a professional meeting, the tone that could be transcribed and read back without revealing anything at all. But she had known him long enough, once, to hear what lived underneath a tone. She did not know if that knowledge was still reliable. She was not certain she wanted to find out. The door opened. The chairman arrived with apologies and papers and the brisk efficiency of a man perpetually 20 minutes behind his own schedule. And the 15 minutes became something that had almost happened and didn't, and Eleanor turned her attention to the meeting that was now beginning and told herself that almost was not the same as something. Lord Rowe arrived late to the subcommittee hearing, which Eleanor had been told was characteristic, that he was a compact man in his late 60s with the kind of face that suggested he had been forming negative opinions since early childhood and had found the practice rewarding. He settled into his chair at the far end of the table, reviewed the materials in front of him with a speed that indicated he was not reading them, and looked at Eleanor with the particular expression of a man who has already made his decision and is prepared to be patient about it. The chairman opened the formal session. Eleanor presented. She had prepared the presentation with the same care she brought to everything structured, evidenced, anticipating objections, and she delivered it in the register she had developed over 4 years of rooms that had not expected her, direct, unhurried, not apologetic. Roland asked 3 questions about public benefit. She answered them. 2 other members asked about the press financial structure. She answered those as well. A 4th member, whose name she had not retained, asked about distribution reach. And she was in the middle of answering when Rowe set down his pen. "That I wonder," he said, "to no one in particular and therefore to everyone, whether we might address the operational question." The chairman looked up. The operational question, the question of Rowe gestured. A small movement that managed to suggest both vagueness and precision. Management. The day-to-day conduct of the enterprise. "I'm sure we all appreciate the thoroughness of the presentation. But a charter of this nature implies a degree of institutional stability that depends rather significantly on the character of the principal." There was a quality of silence in the room that Eleanor had learned to recognize. Not the silence of people waiting for the next sentence, but the silence of people who knew what the next sentence was going to be and were arranging their faces. "Lady Blackwood is the principal," Rowe continued. "A young woman, recently bereaved, operating, as I understand it, without a formal business partner or male trustee. The press has operated successfully for 4 years, Eleanor said. The financial records are in the committee materials." "Financial records?" "Yes." Rowe looked at them briefly. "Though one might observe that 4 years of operation under informal conditions. Shall we say don't necessarily speak to the judgment required for the responsibilities that accompany a charter." "Informal." The word landed with the weight it was meant to carry. She knew exactly what he was doing. She had been in enough rooms to understand the grammar of this particular sentence. Way informal meant irregular, meant suspect, and judgment meant the specific kind of judgment that women were understood to lack in matters of consequence, and the entire construction was designed to raise a question that would require no answer. Only the raising. She kept her expression exactly where it was. James had been quiet through the presentation. She was aware of him at the edge of her vision, seated 2 chairs to her left, his folder closed in front of him. With the stillness she had catalogued as either natural or performed and still could not definitively classify. She did not look at him. She was composing her response to Rowe, which needed to be measured enough not to appear defensive and direct enough to close the line of inquiry. When James spoke, "The judgment question is interesting," he said. His voice had a different quality in this room than it did in his sitting room on Grosvenor Square. Lighter. Almost pleasant. The voice of a man who found the current topic mildly diverting. Rowe looked at him. "The press publication record includes 4 works that have been cited in Commons Committee reports in the past 2 years. James opened his folder without apparent urgency. "The Holbrook essays we re-referenced in the Select Committee on Agricultural Distress in February. Twice. The committee chairman described them as he found the page unusually rigorous for privately published work." He set the folder down. "That's the judgment question answered. I think, he said. Pleasantly. Unless there's a version of unusually rigorous that implies institutional instability, Rowe's expression did not change significantly. The parliamentary citation is noted twice. James said. Both citations are in the materials. He turned a page. Page 11. A brief silence. The chairman cleared his throat and moved to the next agenda item, and the hearing continued with the professional momentum of an institution that had decided to proceed. And Rowe did not return to the question of judgment, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and her expression composed and felt something in her chest that she did not immediately examine, after the session. The room cleared with the usual efficiency of people who had other places to be. Eleanor was gathering her folio when James appeared at her elbow. You should have a barrister present for the full committee, he said. She looked at him, not because you can't speak for yourself. He said. Because Rowe will have prepared something more specific by then. And a barrister can object to procedure in ways that you can't without appearing difficult. That I was going to say adversarial. A slight pause. But yes, she closed her folio. Thank you. For what you said that it was accurate. He said it the way he had said the thing about reading carefully, the tone that could be transcribed without revealing anything. Accuracy is useful in committee rooms, she should have left it at that. She nearly did. Page 11, she said instead. You had the citation on page 11. Without checking that, he picked up his own folder from the table. The materials were thorough. He said. I read them. He left before she could answer. She stood in the emptying committee room for a moment, her folio under her arm. Listening to the sound of a cart in the street outside and the distant ordinary noise of a building full of people doing the things that buildings full of people do. I read them. He had read the parliamentary citation records. He had cross-referenced them with the press publication list before a hearing he had not been required to attend. He had known which page the citation was on. She walked out of the committee room and down the corridor toward the stairs, and she told herself this was what it looked like when someone was useful, and that useful was a category she understood. And that she should be grateful for it and nothing else. She was nearly at the stairs when she realized she was not being entirely honest with herself. The stairs at Westminster had 17 steps. Eleanor knew this because she had counted them on the way up. Which was the kind of thing she did when she needed to keep her mind occupied and her face arranged. She counted them again on the way down, her folio under her arm, the sound of the committee room still present somewhere in the back of her. Hedrow's voice, the word informal. The quality of silence that had followed it. Page 11. She had reached the bottom step and was moving toward the entrance hall when she heard him behind her. Lady Blackwood. She turned. James was 3 steps above her. Which put him at a height he didn't need. Was already taller than her by several inches on level ground, and he descended the remaining steps without hurry and fell into pace beside her, ill-arranged for a list of sympathetic barristers. He said. For the full committee, you don't need to do that I know. He held the outer door, and she went through it because refusing would have required more energy than she currently had available. The list will be at your offices by Friday. Outside. The November air had the particular quality of London cold, not sharp, but persistent, the kind that settled into wool and stayed. Eleanor pulled her coat closer. On the pavement. The usual traffic of men in dark coats moving between the various buildings in which the country was administered. Her carriage was waiting at the end of the courtyard. She could see it from here 40 feet. Perhaps 45, James walked beside her. She was aware of this with a precision that she found irritating. The specific distance between them, perhaps 18 inches. The sound of his footsteps on the stone. The fact that he was not speaking, which was not unusual for him. But which in the current context had a quality of deliberateness she couldn't entirely account for. 30 feet, Rowe will have something prepared for the full committee. She said. You said as much yourself. He will, something more specific than informal conditions, almost certainly. A pause. He'll look for something in the press publication history that he can frame as evidence of poor judgment. Something controversial enough to justify concern without being specific enough to argue against directly. She thought of the agricultural essays. The poetry. The 3 pamphlets from 2 years ago on the subject of female education that she had published under a pseudonym so thoroughly constructed that even Margaret didn't know the author's real name, and if he NDS it, then well need a better argument than accuracy. He said it without particular inflection. Which is why the barrister matters. We. She noted the word and set it aside. Because examining it would lead somewhere she was not prepared to go on 17 steps worth of processing time. They reached the carriage. Her coachman saw her coming and climbed down from his box to open the door. Thomas, who had been with her for 3 years and had the useful quality of appearing to observe nothing while observing everything, James reached the door first. It was a small thing, the natural reflex of a man who had been raised to perform these particular gestures. And she had watched him perform them for other women at a dozen social occasions and felt nothing except the mild awareness that he was present. She knew this. She reminded herself of it that he opened the door. She took hold of the frame to step up. His hand was on the door, near the handle. And her hand was on the frame, and for a moment they were close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him through the cold air. 3 seconds. Perhaps 4. Then she was up and settled, and Thomas had taken the door, and she was looking down at him from the carriage interior. He did not step back immediately. "You didn't sleep?" he said. She looked at him, after the Elmsworth ball. His voice had the same register it had held all morning, professional, measured. The tone that revealed nothing. But he was still standing at her carriage door, and the committee session was over, and there was no professional reason for the question. "You didn't sleep that night?" That she stopped. Started again. "How would you know that?" Something moved through his expression. It was brief, and she almost missed a thing that had been standing in his eyes at the end of the waltz, the one that didn't yet know how to walk. "You look different when you haven't slept," he said. "You hold your left shoulder slightly higher." A pause that lasted 1 second longer than was necessary. "You have since I've known you." The cold air sat between them. She did not know what to do with this information. She did not know what to do with the fact that he had kept it. Had noticed it, kept it, and was only now producing it in the doorway of a carriage outside the House of Lords on a Tuesday in November, with 17 steps and a subcommittee hearing behind them. She did not know what to do with "Since I've known you," which was a span of time that included things she had spent 5 years not thinking about. "Thomas," she said. "Ma'am, Grosvenor Square tomorrow," she told James. Because it was the only sentence available to her that was both true and containable. "You'll need to discuss the barrister question." That he stepped back. 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock, Thomas closed the door. The carriage moved. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and watched the buildings of Westminster pass outside the window, and did not think about her left shoulder, and did not think about "Since I've known you," and was entirely unsuccessful on both counts. She told herself, on the way home, that the shoulder observation was nothing. She told herself this with some vigor. She told herself that a man who had known her for 6 years, 1 year of engagement, 5 years of careful distance, would naturally accumulate certain incidental observations. That this was not the same as watching. That there was a significant difference between the peripheral awareness that any person develops of someone they have been in proximity to, and the particular, sustained, deliberate kind of attention that would be required to notice, retain, and then produce, at a carriage door in November. The specific detail of which shoulder she raised when she hadn't slept. She was still conducting this argument with herself when the carriage turned on to Cheyne Walk. She did not reach a verdict that satisfied her. The ledger was Margaret's idea. "I am not suggesting anything," Margaret said, setting the account book on Eleanor's desk with the careful neutrality of someone absolutely suggesting something. "I'm simply noting that when I was reconciling the subscription records this morning, I found an irregularity." Eleanor looked up from the manuscript she had been failing to read for the past 40 minutes. "What kind of irregularity?" "The pleasant kind." Margaret opened the ledger to a page near the back, where a column of entries ran down in her precise hand. "We have a standing subscription account. Anonymous. Opens 4 years ago, approximately 6 months after the first Meridian imprint." Eleanor set down her pen. "The subscriber purchases 2 copies of every first edition." Margaret continued. "Without exception. Including the Holbrook third pamphlet, which we both agreed at the time was probably only going to move 40 copies total. She paused. It moved 43. Our anonymous subscriber accounts for 2 of them. What's the delivery address? Margaret turned the ledger to face her. The address was written in the column with the same clerical tidiness as every other entry. A number on Grosvenor Square. The specific number she had been to twice in the past week. The number she now knew corresponded to a house with Portland stone facing. And a single boot beside the umbrella stand and a sitting room that overlooked the plane trees. Eleanor looked at the address for a long moment. 23 titles, Margaret said. Every first edition. For 4 years. I counted. She closed the ledger with a soft sound. I thought you should know. Eleanor said nothing that I can be elsewhere. Margaret offered. If you want to sit with that for a moment that I am fine. You're doing the thing where you go very still that I am always still, you're doing the particular still. Margaret picked up the ledger and set it on the shelf behind her with the practiced motion of someone returning an object to it. South Proper Place. I'll go check on the Hartley proofs. Take as long as you need. She left. The door closed with a quietness that was clearly intentional. Eleanor sat at her desk in the offices of Meridian Press, the press she had built from the remnants of a marriage settlement and 4 years of Seventh. Nowadays Anne looked at the middle distance and did the arithmetic she had been trying not to do since Tuesday outside the House of Lords. 23 titles. 4 years. 2 copies each, which meant he had kept one and what? Given one away. The 2-copy subscription was standard for institutional buyers, for libraries, for the kind of collector who wanted a reading copy and a clean copy. It was not standard for a single man in a house on Grosvenor Square who had, as far as she was aware, no institutional affiliation that would require a second copy of a pamphlet about agricultural drainage, unless he had been reading one and keeping one. Unless he had been reading one carefully enough to quote from memory, carefully enough to know which edition had the misprint. Carefully enough to have the parliamentary citation on page 11 without checking and keeping one for reasons she was not going to examine in this office on a Thursday afternoon while Margaret was pretending to check the Hartley proofs. She opened the drawer of her desk. Inside, among the usual accumulation of correspondence and contract drafts and notes she had written to herself at odd hours, was the card he had sent her 8 days ago. I understand you are seeking the Royal Charter. I may be of use. She had told herself she had kept it for professional reference. She had kept it because she was not yet ready to not have it. 23 titles. She closed the drawer. She had built th. Is pressed to belong to herself. Not to a husband, not to a family. Not to the version of the future she had believed in at 21 when she had stood in a room in Mayfair and let herself be fitted for a life that had subsequently been removed from consideration. She had built it because it was the one thing she could build that no one could take back. And it was hers, and the work in it was real, and she did not need anyone to have been paying attention. She sat in her chair for a while longer, then she took out a sheet of paper and wrote, tomorrow at 3. As agreed. There is an additional matter I wish to discuss. She sealed it before she could reconsider. She gave it to the boy to deliver before she could unseal it. Then she went back to the manuscript she had been failing to read and failed to read it for another hour. And outside the window the November light went the particular amber color of late afternoon, and she told herself she was not thinking about any of it, she was thinking about all of it that he was not there when she arrived, the butler Collins. She had learned his name by the second visit, showed her to the same sitting room as before, offered tea, and withdrew with the information that his Grace had been detained at the Lords but expected within the quarter hour. Eleanor did not sit, she had not sat the first time either. And she did not sit now, because sitting required a kind of settled patience she did not currently possess. She stood at the window and watched the plane trees in the square dropping their last leaves onto the pavement in a slow, indifferent way that seemed designed to illustrate something about the passage of time that she did not need illustrated. She had come with a specific purpose. She had written it on the card. There is an additional matter I wish to discuss. The additional matter was the ledger. The delivery address. The 23 titles over 4 years. She had constructed, on the walk from Cheyne Walk to Grosvenor Square, a precise and reasonable set of sentences for raising this topic. which would allow him to explain it in whatever terms he chose and would allow her to receive that explanation without revealing that she had spent the better part of 2 days failing not to think about it. She was ready. She had the sentences prepared, she was looking at the plane trees and rehearsing them for the fourth time when she turned, for no reason she could have articulated, and looked at the bookshelves. The sitting room had 2 walls of shelves, which she had registered on her first visit as the kind of well-appointed background detail common to houses of this type, books as furniture, organized by size and binding. The kind of library assembled by an estate rather than a person. She had not looked at them closely, she looked at them now. The shelves on the left wall were what she had expected. History. Political economy. Military history in considerable quantity. Which made sense for a man who had come of age during wartime. Several runs of periodicals. Bound by year. The collected works of the usual classical authors in the usual leather bindings. The shelves on the right wall were different, she crossed to them before she had made a conscious decision to do so. The books here were newer, on average the last decade's publications. Mostly fiction. Natural philosophy. A shelf of travel writing. And then, on the third shelf from the bottom, a section that occupied approximately 18 inches of horizontal space and was arranged with a slightly different quality of attention than the rest, not by size, not by binding color, but in a sequence that she recognized because she had established it herself, chronological. By publication date, 23 books. Her 23 books. Every title Meridian Press had produced since its first imprint 4 years ago, arranged in the order she had published them. 2 copies each standing side by side on the shelf. She pulled out the first titly, a collection of natural philosophy essays by a man named Garrett who had subsequently become moderately well known, and opened it. The pages were marked, not with slips of paper. With pencil. Directly on the page marginalia in a hand she recognized from the documents she had reviewed in committee, neat and economical. The handwriting of a man who had been educated to write quickly and legibly. The marks were not decorative. They were responsive. In the margin beside a paragraph about the nature of gravitational force, someone had written, "This argument requires a stronger premise." See Newton, Principia. Book 3. On the following page, a passage had been underlined and annotated. Garrett understates his own case here. The observation about pendulum motion is the point. Why is he apologizing for it? She put the book back and took out another, the second Holbrook pamphlet. The one about tenant land management that she had argued over in her own margins before acquiring it. The annotations in this one were denser. Whole paragraphs marked with brackets. A note in the margin that said, "This is the chapter the Select Committee should have read before the February hearings." Another, lower on the page, "Holbrook has met this man. Does he know it?" She stood at the shelf with the pamphlet open in her hands and read the marginalia in the same way she read her author's work attentively. Following the argument, trying to understand the mind behind it, that it was a good mind. It was an exact mind, given to precision rather than ornamentation, with the qualities she prized most in the work she chose to publish. It engaged honestly with ideas it disagreed with before dismissing them. In the margin beside a Holbrook passage about the limits of parliamentary reform, the annotation read, "He's wrong about the mechanism but right about the outcome. Both things are true. He should say so." She took out a third book. Then a fourth. The annotations continued consistent, careful. The record of someone who had been reading not to possess the books but to think with them. And the sixth book, a volume of essays on educational philosophy that she had published 18 months ago. The one she had been least certain about commercially and most certain about in every other sense. She found a page near the end where the handwriting changed, not in style. In content, the essay on the page was about the value of educating women for their own benefit rather than to make them more pleasing companions. It was the essay she had argued hardest to include, the one she had known would cost her with certain readers and had included anyway because it was true and because Meridian Press existed, in some fundamental way, to publish things that were true regardless of cost. In the margin, in the same neat economical hand, "She's right. Obviously she's right. I don't know why this is still being argued, below it, in smaller letters, as though written at a different moment. I wonder if she reads these. She stood very still. That I wonder if she reads these, that he knew the press was hers. He had known before the subcommittee hearing had sent his card to her offices. He had mentioned her publication record with the specificity of someone who had examined it. He had known since before she had told him, which meant he had known from some other source, for some length of time she couldn't calculate from available evidence, and he had sat with that knowledge. And read her books, and written in the margins, and then written. I wonder if she reads these in the margin of the essay she had been most certain about, the one that had cost her, the one that was true. She heard the front door, she heard Colin's voice in the hall, and then James' voice. And then footsteps on the stairs. She did not put the book back. She was standing at the shelf with it open in her hands when the sitting room door opened and he walked in. He stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the book. He looked at the shelf behind her, which still had a gap where she had removed it, the remaining books leaning slightly into the space. Neither of them spoke. She had prepared sentences for this meeting. They were entirely unavailable to her. Your Grace, she said finally. Her voice was level. She was somewhat surprised by this. Lady Blackwood. His was level too, which was less surprising. He had more practice. She held out the book. He crossed the room and took it from her. He looked down at the open page, the essay, the margin, the small annotation in smaller letters. She watched him read it. She watched something in his face that was not quite an expression and not quite the absence of one. You knew the press was mine, she said. Before you sent the card. Yes. How long have you known? He closed the book. Since the second year. The second year. Meridian Press had existed for 4 years. He had known it was hers for 3 of them. He had sat on the other side of this city, in this room, reading her books and writing in the margins and knowing they were hers for 3 years. And he had said nothing and sent nothing and produced no evidence of it until she had found it herself. Why didn't you say anything? He set the book down on the table between them with a care that suggested he was giving himself a moment. Because saying something would have required explaining why I knew, and explaining why I knew would have required a conversation. I wasn't. He stopped. Wasn't what? He looked at her. Ready for? He said. I wasn't ready for. She looked at the shelf. 23 books. 3 years of knowing. There's something else. She said. Something you haven't told me. Yes, you said so. At the end of last week's meeting. There's a reason I haven't told you. Yes. That I am asking now. That he was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, but the quality she had learned to distinguish from it. The quiet of a man assembling something he had not previously been required to say aloud. She waited, because she had also learned, over 6 years of knowing him in various configurations, that interrupting this particular silence produced worse results than enduring it. Not tonight. He said. She stared at him. That I know that's. He stopped again. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm asking you to give me until Friday. You've had 3 years. That I know. He held her gaze. I know that. Eleanor. It was the first time he had said her name, her actual name, not Ellie. Not Lady Blackwood since before the engagement ended. It landed differently than she had expected. Not softer. More precise. Like a key that fit a lock she had forgotten she was carrying. Friday. She said. Friday. It'll come to the press. She picked up her gloves from the chair. Her hands were steady, which she considered a minor personal achievement. I'll expect you at 10. That she left before he could say anything else. Because she was at the limit of what she could hold with her face arranged correctly, and she was not going to let him see what was on the other side of it. Not yet. Not until she knew what Friday contained. Friday contained rain. Eleanor arrived at the press at 8:30. Which was her usual time, and spent an hour and a half doing the work that needed doing, reviewing the Hartley proofs, approving the print order for the new Holbrook piece. Writing 3 letters that had been waiting for her attention for longer than was professional. She did all of this with complete concentration and did not look at the clock. She looked at the clock 4 times. Margaret arrived at 9. Assessed the state of the office with the acuity she brought to everything, and said. You've rearranged the Hartley proofs twice that I am reviewing them. You reviewed them last Tuesday. And Wednesday. Margaret hung up her coat and took her seat with the settled efficiency of a woman who had decided not to address a thing directly and was demonstrating this decision through productivity. I'll be in the back with the Sinclair manuscript if you need me. She went to the back. Eleanor reviewed the Hartley proofs a third time and retained nothing from them. James arrived at 10 past 10, which was late enough that she had begun to construct the possibility that he wasn't coming. Which she had then dismantled because it was not useful, which had left her at the window watching the rain on Cheyne Walk when she heard the knock. He was wet. Not dramatically had a coat and presumably a hat, though the hat was absent. Which meant he had removed it somewhere between the street and the door, but his shoulders were damp and there was rain on his face and he looked, for the first time since she had re-encountered him, like a man who had not entirely planned this. Collins was not here to take his coat. She was not his butler. She took his coat anyway, because it needed somewhere to go, and hung it on the stand near the door. And when she turned back he was standing in the middle of her office looking at Meridian Press with the same attention he brought to everything, taking in the shelves of manuscripts, the print samples pinned to the wall, the particular organized disorder of a working room. Sit down, she said. Pleased that he sat. She sat across from him. Between them, her actual desk, with its actual papers and its actual ledger and the professional reality of the thing she had built, which felt, for reasons she didn't examine, important to have present. Friday, she said. Friday. He agreed. He was quiet for a moment. The rain against the window. The distant sound of Margaret not moving in the back room, which meant Margaret was absolutely listening. The engagement ended because my father required it, he said. You know that part. His political arrangement with the Cavendish family required an alliance with their eldest daughter, and I was the available instrument for that arrangement, and he was not a man who offered explanations, only terms. He paused. The terms were the title, the estate, and everything attached to both, in exchange for doing what he required. I was 23. I had nothing that was not attached to the title. She knew this. In outline. She had known for 5 years that there had been family pressure. It had not been difficult to deduce. The engagement had ended too cleanly, too suddenly, with too little of the hesitation that characterized his other decisions. For it to have been entirely his own choice. What she had not known was the rest. That's one reason, she said. You said there was another. He looked at her steadily. The other reason was mine. Not my father's. He seemed to be selecting words with care. The way she selected words for manuscripts that mattered, trying for accuracy rather than effect. I was afraid. Of what? Of not being enough. He said it simply, without apparent embarrassment. Which was somehow harder to receive than if he had said it with difficulty. My father had spent the previous 3 years demonstrating, with some consistency, that the title was the only valuable thing about me. That without it I was. A brief pause. Unimpressive was the word he preferred. And I believed him, sufficiently, to think that when you eventually arrived at the same conclusion, which I believed you would, the damage would be. He stopped. I couldn't see the other side of it. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. She had spent 5 years building a version of that Tuesday in March that she could live with. In the version she had built, he had been cold. Decisive. A man who had looked at her and found her insufficient and had said so in the cleanest way available. That version had been painful, but it had been structurally sound. It had given her something to build against, and she had built against it. And Meridian Press was in part the result of that building. This version was different. This version had a 23-year-old man standing on a staircase 1 step above her, afraid that she would find him unimpressive, afraid to give her the opportunity to discover it. Choosing the ending before she could write it herself. This version was harder. You should have told me. She said that. I know. 5 years ago. You should have told me then. Yes. He did not argue with this. I know that too. Instead you sent me away and spent 3 years reading my books. Something crossed his face. A brief, unguarded thing. Yes, and writing in the margins. Yes, and not saying anything. Yes. He held her gaze. I was better at reading than at saying. She looked at him. He looked back. The rain continued. In the back room, Margaret was maintaining a silence so complete that it was itself a form of presence. "There's still something you haven't said," Eleanor said. "You've explained the past. That's not the same as saying what you want now." That he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to court you. Properly. In daylight. Where people can see." He said it the way he had said the thing about fear, with the directness of a man who had spent considerable time arriving at the sentence and was going to say it correctly now that he was here. "I want to tell your father that the man he thought was his daughter's most sensible acquaintance has been entirely unreasonable about her for approximately 3 years and would like the opportunity to demonstrate this formally." She felt something shift in her chest. She had been managing that shift for 10 days, keeping it behind the wall she had built. The one made of ledger entries and folio organization and 17-step staircases. 3 years, she said, the Bellingham Assembly. 1812, he didn't look away. "You were wearing green. You were laughing at something your friend had said." And the whole room. He stopped. Amended. "I noticed," she had been 21. She had worn her best dress to the Bellingham Assembly because she had hoped he would be there, which she had told no one, and she had laughed at something Clara had said about the punch, which had been genuinely funny. And she had not known he was watching. 3 years before the engagement ended, he had been watching. "You should have said something then," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. She noted this as a fact and decided it was acceptable. "That I know." A pause. "I was afraid then too. Are you afraid now?" He considered this with what appeared to be genuine attention. "Yes," he said. "Considerably. But I'm more afraid of not saying it than of what happens after." The rain against the window. Margaret, in the back room, making no sound at all. Eleanor sat with everything she had just been given. 3 years, the Bellingham Assembly, the green dress. The margins of 23 books, the fear that had looked like coldness for so long that she had mistaken the surface for the substance and felt the wall doing what walls do when the thing they were built against turns out to be the wrong shape. "That I have a press to run," she said. "That I know, and the full committee hearing is in 3 weeks, and I still need a barrister. That I have a list, and am not." She stopped. "I'm not going to be easy about this." Something shifted in his face then, not the almost expression she had been cataloguing for 10 days, but something complete. Something that had been waiting behind it. "I know," he said. "I read your books. You've never been easy about anything. It's one of the more," he seemed to consider the word, "consistent things about you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come back Thursday," she said. "With the barrister list, Thursday," and well, she stopped again. Found the sentence. "Well, talk about the rest of it." That he stood when she stood. He collected his coat from the standstill damp and put it on. And she watched him button it with the ordinary movements of a man getting ready to go out into the rain, which was the most ordinary thing she had seen him do and was, for that reason, the most disarming. At the door he paused. "The essay," he said. "The one about education. The last essay in the Fairfax volume." She looked at him. "The annotation," he said. "The one about I wonder if she reads these." A brief pause. "I'm glad you read it." That he left. The door closed behind him with the soft sound of a latch catching. And Eleanor stood in the middle of her office in the rain-gray light of a Friday morning and looked at the wall where her print samples were pinned and felt the wall in her chest do the last of its structural rearranging. From the back room, after a moment of continued silence, Margaret said, "Shall I put the kettle on?" Eleanor sat down at her desk. "Yes," she said. "Please." Lord Rowe found her at the Cavendish tea on Wednesday. She had known he would. He was not a man who left things to chance. And she had watched him at the subcommittee hearing with sufficient attention to understand that his objection to Meridian Press was not procedural. It was categorical. She was the wrong kind of person operating the wrong kind of enterprise. And the hearing had not resolved this for him, it had simply relocated it. He approached her between the second and third cups. When the room had settled into the comfortable murmur of people who had said the interesting things and were now saying the comfortable ones. Lady Cavendish had provided excellent biscuits and a fire that was slightly too warm. And Eleanor had been engaged in a conversation about botanical illustration with a woman whose name she had not caught, which she had been genuinely enjoying. When she saw Ro making his way across the room with the particular purposefulness of a man who had an errand, she finished her sentence about aquatint engraving. She smiled. She waited, Lady Blackwood. He stopped beside her with the social grace of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. What a pleasant coincidence that it was not a coincidence. They had both received the same invitation, which Lady Cavendish sent to the same list she had been sending it to for a decade, and they both knew this. Lord Ro, she said. How do you do? Very well. Very well. He accepted a biscuit from a passing tray with the ease of a man at home in any room he chose to enter. I hope the subcommittee process hasn't been too arduous. These things can be a small pause. Wearing, for those not accustomed to them, I've found it instructive. Eleanor said, yes. He ate the biscuit. Regarded her with the pleasant expression of a man about to say something unpleasant. I hope you'll take it in the spirit of collegial concern when I mention and do tell me if I'm overstepping that there has been some comment. In certain quarters, comment about. What? About the nature of your association with Nottingham. He said it with the careful neutrality of a surgeon describing a wound. You'll understand that the committee is sensitive to any appearance of furgular influence. It wouldn't do, I think, for your application to be seen as the product of a personal connection rather than its own merits. There it was. Clean, precise, wrapped in collegial concern, she understood exactly what he was doing. The threat was elegant in its construction, it required no evidence, no specifics. No actionable claim. It simply planted a seed personal connection, irregular influence and left it to grow in the particular soil of a committee room where appearances mattered more than facts and a woman's association with a powerful man was, by definition, available for interpretation that it was also. She noted, an attack on the two things she had built simultaneously and carefully and could not afford to lose, her press and her reputation. Both were the same structure. Both would fall the same way that I appreciate the concern. She said. Her voice was the temperature of the room, neither warm nor cold, the precisely calibrated nothing that she had learned to produce in situations like this one. He'll certainly take it under advisement. Good. Good. Rose seemed satisfied. He took his leave with the same pleasant efficiency with which he had arrived, moving back across the room toward a knot of men near the fireplace. And Eleanor stood with her teacup and watched him go and felt the specific cold clarity of understanding that she had been managed. She returned to Cheyne Walk that afternoon and wrote a letter. She wrote it 3 times. The first version said what she wanted to say. The second version said what was prudent. The third version, which she sent, said, I have reason to believe my continued association with the committee process may be creating complications I had not anticipated. I am grateful for your assistance to date. I will manage the remaining proceedings independently. She sealed it. She gave it to the boy. She sat at her desk afterward and looked at the print samples on the wall, the Holbrook cover, the Fairfax title page. The small botanical illustration she had used for the first Meridian imprint 4 years ago, and told herself this was the correct decision. That she had built this press without him and would obtain the charter without him, and that the clean, careful distance she had maintained for 5 years was a structure that had served her and would continue to serve her, and was not something she was prepared to dismantle because of annotated margins and green dresses and 3 years she hadn't known about. She looked at the botanical illustration for a long time, then she went home. She heard about it from Margaret, on a Thursday morning. 9 days later, Margaret came in at 9 with the Sinclair proofs under one arm and the expression she wore when she had information she was uncertain how to deliver, a slight compression of her mouth, a quality of waiting in her eyes. There's news from the committee, she said. Eleanor looked up from the quarterly accounts. The hearing date's been moved. No. Margaret set the proofs down. It's about Ro, she told it simply, the way she told everything, without elaboration. In the order it had happened. A colleague of her brother's sat on one of the Lord's administrative subcommittees. This colleague had attended a closed preliminary session 3 days ago, a routine matter. Nothing to do with press licensing, at which Lord Rowe had been notably quiet on a subject he had previously been notably vocal about. He dropped his objection. Margaret said. To the licensing expansion generally. Not just to our application. Withdrew from the topic entirely. Eleanor was still. Why, my brother's colleague didn't know. Margaret paused. But he mentioned that at the start of the session, before Rowe arrived. There was a document at his place at the table. No one knew where it came from. Rowe read it before the session began. She seemed to be selecting the word. Quiet, after that. For the rest of the morning, what document? He didn't know that either. Margaret looked at her. But he did say that Nottingham had been in the building the previous afternoon. Eleanor set down her pen. She did this carefully. With the deliberate attention of someone who needed their hands to do something ordinary while the rest of them processed something that was not. She set the pen down. She straightened the quarterly accounts. She looked at the window, where the November light was doing the amber thing again. And she thought about Rowe's face at the Cavendish tea, the pleasant precision of irregular influence, personal connection, and she thought about the letter she had sent. James had received her letter. She had told him, clearly and in writing, to withdraw. To remove himself from the proceedings. To leave her to manage it independently. He had received the letter and gone to the Lords the following afternoon and placed a document at Rowe's seat. She did not know what the document contained. She could construct a reasonable hypothesis. Rowe had been on committees long enough to have accumulated the kind of history that accumulated on committees. And James had been in Parliament long enough to know where to find it, but the specifics were less important than the shape of the thing itself. He had read her letter. He had understood it. And he had done this anyway, not in her presence, not for her to witness. Not as a gesture designed to be received and acknowledged. He had gone to a building she wasn't in and placed a piece of paper at a table she would never sit at and walked away, she found out 9 days later, from her editor. Through 3 degrees of removal, she sat with this for a moment. Margaret sat across from her with the Sinclair proofs and did not pretend to be looking at them. I need to go out. Eleanor said that I thought you might. I'll be back by 2. I'll hold the Sinclair proofs. She put on her coat and hat and walked out into the November morning and turned toward Grosvenor Square. He answered the door himself. Which she had not expected. Collins appeared at his shoulder a moment later, which clarified that James had simply been closer to the door when she knocked, but the image remained the Duke of Nottingham in his shirt-sleeves on a Thursday morning, opening his own front door. With ink on his right hand. You have ink on your hand, she said. He looked at it. I was writing. On a Thursday morning. I write on most mornings. He stepped back from the door. Come in. She came in. He led her not to the sitting room but to the study on the ground floor. Which was a different room, entirely smaller. With the specifically inhabited quality of a room that was actually used rather than maintained for use. Papers on the desk. A fire that had been burning long enough to have settled into comfortable embers. 2 chairs angled toward the fireplace that had not been arranged for receiving visitors. He stood in the middle of the room and he stood near the desk, and she said. Rowe withdrew. Yes, you went to the Lords the day after I asked you to withdraw. Yes, I wrote to you. I told you I would handle the remaining proceedings independently. You did, and you went anyway. He was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of stillness that she had spent the better part of the month trying to classify, and she understood now, standing in his study with the fire at her back, that it was neither natural nor performed. It was what he looked like when he was paying complete attention. Rowe's objection was not about your press, James said. It was about you. The distinction matters. He moved to the desk, not to sit but to lean against it, crossing his arms in a way that suggested he was being precise about something. A procedural objection to a press application can be addressed through procedure. An objection to the person behind the application is a different problem. Because it doesn't require evidence. It only requires repetition. I know that, then you know that withdrawing from the proceedings wouldn't have resolved it. Rowe would have raised the same objection at the full committee, and without anyone positioned to counter it procedurally. It would have landed. That wasn't your decision to make. No, he said. It wasn't. He said it simply, without qualification. No argument, no redirection, no attempt to reframe the fact of what he had done as something more defensible than it was. She had been bracing for the defense had prepared. Somewhere in the walk from Cheyne Walk, a series of responses to the things he might say and the absence of it left her briefly without footing. You went anyway, she said again. Yes, because you decided that your judgment about what I needed superseded my own. He looked at her. No. He said. Because I couldn't not. The fire settled behind her. Outside, a cart on Grosvenor Square, the ordinary sound of a Thursday morning proceeding without particular awareness of itself. That I know the difference. He said. Between deciding I know better and not being able to stop. I'm not asking you to excuse the second one. I'm telling you what it was. She looked at him for a long moment. At the ink on his hand. At the firelit study with its inhabited disorder. At the man who had sent her a card from this hoe. Used and read her books in this room and written. I wonder if she reads these in the margin of her best essay and then gone to a building she wasn't in and quietly dismantled the obstacle she had told him to leave alone. What was in the document? She said. Something moved in his expression. A record of a property transaction, he said. From 1811. Involving a mill in Derbyshire and a rather creative interpretation of the terms of a tenant lease. Was it accurate? Entirely, and Rowe knew that. He knew that. A pause. He also knew that I knew it. And that I had chosen to produce it at that particular moment rather than any of the previous 14 years during which it had been available to me. He held her gaze. Timing is its own argument. She turned away from him toward the fire. She stood there for a moment, looking at the embers. Doing the arithmetic of the past 4 weeks, the waltz, the card, the hearing, the shoulder at the carriage door, the books, the margins, the letter she had written and the thing he had done after reading it. That I am still angry, she said. To the fire. That I know, you should have asked me. Yes. That if you do something like this again. She stopped. Amended. If there is ever again something that concerns me and my press and my name, you will ask me first. Whatever you think, whatever you know. Whatever document you happen to have access to. You asked. A pause. Yes. She turned around. That he was still leaning against the desk, still with his arms crossed, still with the ink on his hand. And he was looking at her with the expression she had catalogued at the end of the waltz, the one that had been kept in a closed room and didn't yet know how to walk, except that it had been walking for several weeks now and had gotten considerably steadier on its feet. That I am still angry, she said again. Because it remained true. That I know, he said. You always were when you thought I wasn't taking you seriously. She stared at him. You used to get the same expression in arguments. He said. That particular stillness. When you were deciding whether to be angry out loud or to file it for later use. The corner of his mouth moved. You generally chose later use. That is. She stopped. That is an extremely accurate observation that I read carefully. He said. When something is worth the attention. She stood in his study on a Thursday morning with the fire behind her and the ink on his hand and 5 years of distance that had turned out to be a different shape than she had thought. And she felt the last of the wall do the last of its structural rearranging. Thursday, she said. That he looked at her. You said come back Thursday. With the barrister list. She kept her voice level. It was more difficult than usual. I'm here on Thursday. Where's the list? He looked at her for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and turned to the desk and picked up a folded paper that had been sitting, she now noticed, directly in front of where he was standing, within easy reach. As though it had been placed there for a purpose. That he held it out. She crossed the room and took it. Their hands did not touch. She was aware of this with the precision she brought to all such calculations. Which was a precision she was becoming increasingly tired of maintaining. The full committee is in 2 weeks. She said. Yes, I'll need to brief the barrister before then. The first name on the list is the best one. Tell him I sent you. She folded the paper. Put it in her coat pocket. Looked at him from a distance of approximately 4 feet. Which was closer than professional and farther than anything else. James, she said. That it was the first time she had used his name. She watched him register a slight thing, a barely there thing, but she had been reading him carefully for a month and she did not miss it. Thank you. she said. For the document. Even though you should have asked that. He held her gaze. You're welcome, he said. Even though I should have asked. She left before she stayed. She was learning to recognize the threshold between those two options. Which was something she had not previously needed to navigate with such frequency. And she was not yet entirely reliable on the distinction, but she was learning. The full committee granted the charter on a Tuesday. Eleanor received the notification by messenger at 11:30. A formal document on heavy paper with the committee seal. The kind of thing she had been waiting 8 months to hold. And she held it for a long moment in the middle of her office before she set it down on her desk and looked at it and felt something she could not immediately name, not triumph. Triumph was what she had expected to feel. What she actually felt was quieter than that, and older. And had a quality of completion that was different from victory, the feeling not of winning something but of becoming something. Which had been the actual project all along. Margaret appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea and the expression of a woman who had decided that this particular moment called for tea rather than words. She set 1 cup on the desk beside the document. She looked at it briefly. Well. She said, well. Eleanor agreed. They drank their tea. Margaret went back to her work. Eleanor sat at her desk and looked at the document and thought about 4 years of 17-hour days and the marriage settlement and the fictional male partner whose correspondence she had been writing for years. And she thought about the first Meridian imprint and the botanical illustration on its cover and the 43 copies of the Holbrook pamphlet that had sold and the 2 that had gone to Grosvenor Square. She was still sitting there at 12:30 when the knock came. She knew the knock. She had been learning his rhythms for a month, the particular way he used a door, neither tentative nor demanding, the knock of a man who announced himself and then waited. Come in, she said. That he opened the door and saw the document on the desk. He read the room, her face, the tea. Margaret's absence with the single glance that she had catalogued in committee rooms and studies and carriage doorways, and he said. It went through, this morning that he looked at the document. Then at her. Something in his face was doing the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency over the past several weeks, the thing she had no longer pretended, even to herself, not to see. Congratulations. He said. His voice was warm in a way it had not been in October, or if it had been she had not allowed herself to hear it. It was always going to go through. The application was excellent. You helped, Roe helped. He said. By withdrawing, that's a generous reading, it's an accurate one. He crossed to the desk and looked at the document, not picking it up, just reading it where it lay. She watched the line of his jaw, the way his eyes moved across the text. The small moment when he reached the official seal and something shifted in his expression that she thought might be relief. She had not considered, until this moment, that he had been worried. James, she said. That he looked up. There's something I want to show you. She said. If you have time. She took him to the press room. It was in the back of the building, a narrow, high-ceilinged space that smelled of ink and paper and the particular warm metal smell of the press itself. Which had been running since 8 that morning and had been quiet for the past hour. 2 compositors had gone to their dinner. The room was empty except for the press and the stacked paper and the drying sheets hung on lines near the window. She had not brought anyone here before. It was not a receiving room. It was not a room for conducting business or maintaining appearances or calculating the precise degree of social distance required to survive a season. It was the room where the actual work happened. And she had kept it separate from everything else with the same care she kept the rest of herself separate, which was considerable. She was tired of the separation. This is where it starts, she said. They were standing in the middle of the room. Between the press and the drying lines. The manuscript comes in through my office. Margaret and I read it. If it's worth publishing, it goes to the compositor Lewis. Usually, he's better with the smaller type than to the press. And then here. He was looking at the drying sheets. She had printed a run of the new Holbrook piece that morning, the one she had been preparing since September. The piece about grain prices and tenant rights that was going to make people uncomfortable in the specific way that meant it was true. How many? He said. 300. First run. He read the top sheet without touching it. She watched him read, the same quality of attention he brought to everything, the attention that did not perform itself. He's angrier in this one. James said that he has more to be angry about. She looked at the sheet. The harvest numbers came in last month. He turned to look at her. They were standing perhaps 3 feet apart, which was closer than they had been since the waltz. And the press room was narrow and smelled of ink, and the light from the high window was the flat gray of December. I owe you an apology, she said. That he waited. That I spent 5 years building a version of what happened that I could live with. She said. And the version I built required you to have been. She stopped. Found the word. Decided. I needed you to have looked at the situation and made a clear choice, because a clear choice was something I could build against. What you actually were was afraid, he said. Afraid. She agreed. Which is harder? Because I was afraid too, and I know what it costs, and I should have. She stopped again. I should have given you more credit for it. That he was very still. The good kind of still. You don't owe me an apology. He said. You owed yourself an accurate account. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this, for approximately 3 years. The corner of his mouth moved. I had the books to read between thoughts. She felt something loosen in her chest, not the wall. That had been coming down in pieces for weeks, but something behind it, something she had not known, was still braced. The Bellingham Assembly. She said. Tell me what you remember. He looked at her steadily. You want me to tell it now? I've been waiting 3 years without knowing I was waiting. I think now is reasonable. A pause. The press room. The ink smell. The gray December light. You were standing near the east wall. He said. With Clara Harwood. You were wearing green, a darker green, not quite emerald, the color of, he seemed to consider. Moss, after rain. Something like that. Clara had said something and you were laughing, and the laugh was real, which was. He stopped, which was what? Noticeable. He said. Because you were already careful, even then. You already knew how to be in a room without. He moved his hand slightly, a gesture that indicated the whole apparatus of social navigation she had been operating for 6 years. Without being used up by it. But the laugh was real. And the whole room seemed. He paused. Brighter. Briefly. Like someone had adjusted a lamp. She stood in her press room on a December morning and heard a man describe a laugh she couldn't remember having, and felt it land somewhere she had not expected. That was 1812. She said, December. The 14th, she stared at him. I know the date, he said, without apology, because I wrote it down. You wrote it. I kept a journal. Sporadically. Less sporadically after the Bellingham Assembly. He held her gaze with the directness he had been deploying for weeks. The quality of a man who had decided that accurate was more important than defended. I have never been particularly skilled at not paying attention to things that matter to me. I became skilled at not appearing to. She was quiet for a moment. I read your essay. She said. The margin note. I wonder if she reads these. I know that I read all of them. Something moved through his face. The full version of the thing she had been seeing partial versions of since October. The thing that had been in a closed room for a long time and had learned to walk. I hoped you would, he said. Eventually. I wasn't certain you'd. He stopped. I wasn't certain I'd have the conversation we're currently having. Were you afraid? Yes. No hesitation. Considerably, and now. He looked at her in the flat gray light of the press room, with the ink smell and the drying Holbrook sheets and the Royal Charter sitting on the desk in the front office, and he said, now I'm more afraid of not having said it than of what comes after. She had heard this once before. In her office. On a Friday morning in the rain. She had heard it and filed it for later use, he had said. He knew she filed things for later use. This was later. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. I didn't go to the Bellingham Assembly because Clara invited me. She said. I went because I knew you'd be there. She held his gaze. Which required more effort than she would have preferred but was necessary. I wore the green dress because I knew you'd be there. And you spent the entire evening talking to Lord Fairfax about canal legislation, and I went home and told myself that I had misread the situation and that I should stop. He exhaled. Stop paying attention to things that weren't paying attention back. That he was very still, they were, he said. Paying attention. I was better at hiding it than you knew. That I know that now, Eleanor. I know. She took one step toward him, which closed the 3 feet to something less. I know you were afraid. I know what it cost you. I know the difference between decided and afraid. And I know which one it was. She looked at him. I'm asking you not to be afraid of this particular thing anymore. He looked at her for a long moment. The press room was very quiet, then he reached out and took her hand, not with the careful lightness of the waltz. Not with the unplanned grip of a man who hadn't meant to hold on, but with the deliberate steadiness of a choice. His thumb pressed against her palm, and she felt the warmth of it through the cold of the morning, and she thought. This is what it feels like when something is not a performance. I'll try, he said, that's all I'm asking. That he held her hand in the press room while the Holbrook sheets dried on their lines and the ink smell settled around them, and December made its gray and ordinary argument outside the window. And for the first time in 5 years Eleanor Gray stood in a room and did not calculate the exits. Her father was in Hertfordshire. He had been in Hertfordshire for the better part of 3 years. Which was where men of his temperament went when London became too much of itself. A modest house on a modest property with a kitchen garden he supervised with more attention than it strictly required, and a library that had not been added to since 1800 but whose existing contents he was working through. With methodical satisfaction, Eleanor wrote to him on Wednesday. She received a reply on Friday, come Sunday. Bring whoever wants bringing. James drove them in his curricle. Which she had not expected. He had a carriage. She had been in it twice now, but he arrived at Cheyne Walk on Sunday morning in a curricle with 2 horses and the slightly wind-disordered quality of a man who had been driving for an hour and not found it unpleasant. The carriage seemed ceremonial. He said, when she looked at the curricle seems informal. Yes. He held out his hand to help her up. I thought informal might be better. For this, she took his hand. She had been taking his hand with increasing frequency over the past week. And she was developing a considered relationship with the fact that she no longer needed to account for the warmth of it. The drive to Hertfordshire took 2 hours. The November roads had improved with the early frost, firm rather than muddy, and James drove with the competence of a man who had been doing this since before it was fashionable and did not need to perform it. They talked. Not about the charter, not about the committee, not about anything with a professional dimension. He asked her about the Holbrook piece, the content. Not the logistics, and she told him about the harvest numbers and the tenant interviews and the 3 letters Holbrook had written her in September when the data came in, and James listened with the full attention she had stopped being surprised by and said. He should send a copy to the Board of Agriculture. I suggested that. What did he say? He said the Board of Agriculture was structurally committed to not knowing things that would require them to act. James considered this. He's not wrong, he's rarely wrong. He's sometimes difficult. But he's rarely wrong. Those often travel together, James said, which was true, and she turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, briefly, before returning his attention to the road. The house was as she remembered it, kitchen garden gone to winter straw. The front path needing attention, her father in the doorway before they had fully stopped, with the expression of a man who had been watching from the window and had decided not to pretend otherwise. That he shook James' hand on the front step. Ashton. Her father said, Sir. James held the handshake a moment longer than courtesy required. Thank you for having me. Hm. Her father assessed him with the directness of a man who had nothing in particular to protect and therefore nothing to be cautious about. Come in, then. Both of you. Eleanor. There's tea. They had tea. Her father asked James about the Lords with the specific curiosity of a man who had no patience for politics but considerable interest in how institutions failed. And James answered him with the same honesty he had been bringing to all his answers lately, not performing authority, not managing the conversation, just saying what he actually thought, which Eleanor found herself watching with the attention she brought to manuscripts. After tea, her father took James to see the kitchen garden. This was not a coincidence. Her father took people to see the kitchen garden when he wanted to talk to them without the structural interference of furniture. Eleanor stayed in the library and looked at the books and listened to the sound of 2 men's voices outside the window, too low to distinguish but present. They were outside for half an hour, when they came back in. Her father's expression had the settled quality of a man who had asked the questions he needed to ask and received the answers he was prepared to accept. He did not report on the conversation. This was also not a coincidence. They stayed for dinner. James helped her father open a bottle of wine. The tea had been placed incorrectly and had developed a difficult cork, which they managed together with a degree of mutual consultation that struck Eleanor as disproportionate to the problem and therefore exactly right. Her father told a story about a neighbor's horse. James told a story about a vote in the Lords that had been decided by a member falling asleep at the wrong moment and accidentally indicating approval. Eleanor listened to both stories and ate the lamb and felt the specific warmth of a room where everyone present was being themselves. On the drive back, the frost was harder and the stars were out, and James handled the horses with the same competent quiet as the morning. After a while she said, "What did he ask you?" "Several things, the garden ones." James was quiet for a moment. The road unspooled ahead of them in the starlight. "He asked how long," he said. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." A pause. The Bellingham Assembly. December 1812. He was quiet for a moment and then he said that long and I said yes, and he looked at the winter cabbages for a while, and then, he said. James seemed to be selecting the phrasing. He said that in his experience, the men who took a long time to say things usually meant them more thoroughly than the men who said them quickly. And then he showed me where the frost had damaged the leaks. She looked at him. In the starlight. His profile had the clean line she had been looking at for 6 weeks and a month and 5 years, depending on how you count it, and she had stopped pretending she wasn't looking. "That he approves," she said. "That he said I should ask you," James said. "That it was your decision. Not his." "He's right, yes." He kept his eyes on the road. "Is that something you want me to do?" "Ask." She looked at the road ahead of them. The frost-white verge. The stars. The particular quality of night in the country that was different from the city, fuller, somehow. "Less interrupted. That I want you to ask," she said. "Not tonight. When you're ready." "That I am ready, when I'm ready," she said, which made him turn to look at her briefly, and she was smiling, a real one, the kind she had been spending 5 years keeping in reserve, and he saw it, and she let him see it. And the horses found their own steady pace on the dark road home. He said, quietly, "That's real." "What is that?" His voice had the warmth in it that she had stopped pretending not to hear. "What you're doing with your face right now." She looked at the road. She was still smiling. "That I know." She said, "I've been waiting." He stopped himself. "How long?" A pause. "The horses. The frost. The stars doing their indifferent and ancient work overhead, since the waltz," he said. "I've been waiting since the waltz to see that." She said nothing. She let the smile stay where it was, on her face. In the cold air, visible to anyone who happened to be looking. That he was looking. 2 weeks later, in her press room, between the ink smell and the Holbrook sheets and the charter on the desk in the front office, he asked. She had her answer ready. She had been ready, she thought, for longer than she had known. Perhaps since the waltz, perhaps since the press room. Perhaps since a December evening in 1812 when she had worn green to a Bellingham assembly and laughed at something Clara said and not known that anyone was paying attention. Someone had been paying attention. She said yes. That he took her hand the way he had in the press room, with the deliberate steadiness of a choice, and she let him hold it, and this time neither of them counted the seconds.